Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Sunday Shot. Thank you for joining us early on a Sunday morning instead of being over on the other place. I am joined, as ever, by my co-host, editor of The Shot, Dave Milner. Hi, Dave.
G'day, Joe. Happy Sunday.
Loving your T-shirt.
Thank you. In honour of Grace Tame and a hilarious moment a few weeks ago.
It was excellent. It's taken a while for it to arrive. I know we couldn't have it for you on episode 1, but here it is on episode 3. And in this episode, we are delighted to be joined by two very impressive guests. The director of the Australia Institute's Climate and Energy Program, Polly Hemming, and a fabulous independent commentator and writer that some of you will recall from his days on the sorely missed Drum, Ketan Joshi, who is joining us all the way from Oslo, so stayed up for the occasion. Thank you very much to you both for joining us on this episode 3 of the Sunday Shot.
Thanks, Joe.
Nice to be here.
Now, we've got a lot to get through because we are going to do a deep dive into where things are at in climate change land on both a global and, importantly, coming up to our next federal election on a domestic front. But before we do, I thought it probably behoves us to just try and gather our jaws from the floor as we reflect a little bit on what happened yesterday in the Oval Office, when we had the president of, well, formerly the president of the free world, seemingly abrogating that role as was predicted that he would, but it is finally happening as both Trump and his little attack pup, J.D. Vance, turned on Zelensky in the most extraordinary and public of ways. Ketan, you're over in Europe. So there'll probably be the most immediate and material impact on European leaders. What has been the response over there?
Norway is directly connected to Russia. We have at the very top of our country, we actually have a land border with Russia. And paranoia, and I don't mean that in a pejorative way, I mean like genuine fear about Russia has been a long-running thing. There's actually a TV show that involves Russia invading Norway because we stopped exporting oil to the country from, I think, about sort of 5 to 7 years ago, if I remember correctly. And so these developments have just had such a huge impact, and they really speak to something very deep and long-running, which is just fear of Russia and what they can do, and literally invasion. And so it's actually quite scary seeing the US, like kind of essentially give up for everything that's wrong with the US. They were actually helping Ukraine defend themselves through the provision of weapons, etc. And then I also just saw just a few moments ago a bit of news that came out that Norway's largest fuel supplier is actually refusing to supply US Navy ships in solidarity with Ukraine, which is actually pretty massive. I mean, this is a huge company. I double checked it. There's an interview with the owner in a local Norwegian media outlet, and he's like, I hate what's happened, and I'm standing in solidarity with Ukraine, and I oppose Russia, so I won't be allowing our ships to refuel US Navy vessels, which is quite remarkable. I don't know how much of a difference it'll actually make. I don't know the numbers on who fuels what, but to stand up like that and make that decision is a big deal, right? So it's not just the fear, but also we're already, just moments after it's happened, when we're still awash in all of the consequences, we're already seeing organizations actually make announcements like this, which I find to be quite astonishing. So it's exhausting, it's scary, but Europe is a relatively large force, and has a lot of capabilities. So we'll see where it goes.
This sounds quite, very, very early days, but sounds promising because we're not, again, very early days, but we've not seen that in Australia. We've actually seen people trying not to talk about this, as far as I can tell. Hey, we've got tweets on the screen.
We have.
And that's a good point, by the way. The leader of the free world thing, before we went on air, I was talking about the fact that this is the lack of a pretense foreign policy. It's been murderous for 60, 70 years. There's a lot of myth making that goes with that, a lot of PR that goes with that. people like Obama would still have been interested in these rare earth minerals. They would have just had better PR around it.
Well, I don't dispute that, but it is nonetheless the case that for nearly 80 years there has been a commitment to NATO, and that Europe and the States have worked in concert on most, but not all, of course, major geopolitical issues, particularly those that do impact on Europe. So it does seem that we've had to that Europe is now having to step up, and it has galvanised that grouping, and indeed brought the UK back closer to Europe. Polly, we've seen there does now seem to be that greater sense of the UK rejoining European forces to try and support Ukraine now that they're being abandoned by the Americans.
Yeah, I think that's very true. And sorry, I can't help myself but to bring it back to climate. But
no, please do, because we're going to jump in there in let's segue.
Yeah, we're off topic.
Yeah. I was just going to say I agree with Dave. The US sort of abdicating its responsibility under the UN, the Global Climate Treaty, the Paris Agreement, notably staying in the UNFCCC, so it still gets to make decisions and undermine and negotiate. But I just think the US retreating actually exposes what was happening anyway, and this can be extrapolated out to broader global the broader global climate policy landscape. The US has been a huge obstructive force for decades. There's just the pretense that it was slightly better under Biden. Actually wasn't. There was still oil and gas being dug up and pumped out more than ever, actually. So I think in some ways it's a useful catalyst because it was a pretense, and now maybe other countries can step into the void.
Can we, before we get into the actual policies and practices which are continuing to impact on the climate trajectories that we're on, can I ask you to set the scene for us? We might start with you, Ketan. Is on our current trajectory, how much, with the kind of activity that's still going on, despite the greenwashing, if you like, how much would the planet be warming in the coming decades, and what would the consequences of that be to our planet and life thereon?
So this is something I have become a little bit obsessed with. Every year around COP, you get this flurry of projections. So what people do is they plug in all of the existing policies around the world, calculate what impact that would have on humanity's emission of greenhouse gases, and then they calculate, okay, if we emitted that much, what would happen to the planet? What would be the consequences for life on Earth? And what we saw from about sort of the signing of the Paris Climate Agreement up till about maybe 2019, 2020, every one of those projections looked a little bit better each time. It's because more policies were being created, the prices of technologies like wind and solar were dropping, and so the prognosis for the future went from about sort of 4-ish degrees, depending on, the types of assumptions that you use, 4 degrees of planetary warming by the year 2100, down to like maybe sort of low 3, upper 2, like 2.9 to 3.1-ish. And it was heralded as a sort of victory in the sense that the prognosis for the future just looked better and better because more and more policies were being created. But what happened in about 2020, and it's been like kind of getting worse ever since, is that the prognosis has flipped. Things are actually getting slightly worse. And, we had this feeling in the climate movement of such momentum and such force, it's like, wow, things are actually getting better. But the seriousness of the situation has increased quite a lot. So if you kind of look at the prognosis now, the most recent one from last year, the world's emissions that were calculated for the year 2024 have actually ended up higher than a bunch of very recent projections as to what 2024 would look like. And that's quite bad, right? Like you often see things like, oh, solar is so much, being deployed faster than projected in the past. But of course, its emissions, those are the things that actually affect the planet's temperature. And emissions are higher than projected. And so I just wanted to highlight not just the prognosis, which everybody kind of recognizes is pretty bad, uh, but the fact that things haven't been getting better for a few years now. And, within a bunch of error bars, things are potentially getting worse, and I would say probably getting worse. And so the other thing on top of that is that the science that examines the last step, which is like you've got your emissions and then you plug it into a model to tell you how the planet changes, that step has seen improved scientific models. And unfortunately, what they say is that at the same levels of warning that at the same levels of warming that we thought were not too bad, actually the physical consequences of say 3 degrees of warming are more catastrophic than we thought they would be a few years ago. So even if the prognosis improves, the level of temperature is more catastrophic than we kind of thought, right? Like 3 degrees of warming does more damage to us than we kind of realized a few years ago.
So it's
And
good.
so, sorry?
So it's good news.
It's it's all good news, don't worry. But this is a real thing. Like, I don't think this is quite widely realized, just how those two things have changed. So, like, the projections into the future are getting worse, and then what we understand about the impact of the same level of emissions, it's the Earth is more sensitive to what we do to it than we first realized, right? And people feel this just by looking at the disasters and the sort of, you can even just go back in a few months and you can think of many examples, right, of the Earth system responding more violently to what we kind of imagined climate change would be like, which is like a slow burn over time. So yeah, it just all those things make it
Yeah.
even more urgent to
Even with
to act
Holly,
on this.
can you paint us a brief picture of the types of impacts that we would be looking at physically if we stay on this sort of low threes trajectory that Ketan's just been outlining?
Yeah, well, Katan's made a really good point is that this is actually all really unpredictable. Well, two things can be true. This is all incredibly unpredictable. We don't know how and when tipping points will manifest because we've never experienced anything like this. It's turning out the planet is far more sensitive than we realised. But at the same time, we know with a really high degree of certainty what the costs of climate change already are and will be in terms of disaster relief, mental health, physical health, gender violence, supply chain disruption, cost of living. We know that the costs are already really high, and subsequently, our leaders should be implementing, really conservative policies, knowing how high those costs already are. But as you asked this question, it occurred to me that you actually, or no one watching this should be relying on us to be telling you this. This is the job of governments and public officials. I know it seems really obvious, but it shows how badly Australians are being failed by both government, industry and policymakers when it comes to communicating the consequences of the climate crisis and the actions that they're taking to address it. So I think most Australians are unaware of the extent to which climate change is and will affect their lives, despite the fact that the Australian government's previously recognised climate change as the greatest threat to the livelihoods of the Pacific region. And sorry, I have to cross-promote, but the Australia Institute does this polling every year, this report called Climate of the Nation, where we track attitudes and understanding of climate policy. And 60% of Australians say that they're not aware or are not sure of any policies or measures the Australian government is taking to protect them from the impacts of climate change. So we know with certainty how bad it already is. It can only get worse, unfortunately, and we're not being told that by the people who are sort of elected to be looking after us.
Polly and Ketan, I wanted to ask you both what role the Australian media has in our understanding as a population, because I've spent most of my life in Australia, And the thing that I keep thinking about is for 30 odd years, I've been hearing about carbon sequestration, which, isn't really a thing. But that's where the discussion has been for 30 years. We've not really tackled this stuff with any sort of intelligence, with any sort of depth. It sort of makes sense that Australians don't really understand this in any sort of serious level, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the irony is that the media loves whipping up fear and hysteria. It's just they do it uh, about things like death taxes or franking credits
People in boats.
or
Yeah.
African gangs. Yeah, that I often get told that climate is a really boring story by journalists. Actually, if you want sort of that salacious fear mongering, climate is the best story.
Yeah.
There's so much to mine there.
I mean, when it
Um,
comes, sorry, Katang.
yeah, I just sort of wanted to quickly throw in there as well. It's such a nice way of putting it, Holly, because you get this weird dichotomy where something a piece of technology will have one single failure, and then it's a series of headlines about how the technology is terrible. But then carbon capture and storage, point source carbon capture and storage, has been treated so weirdly for decades because it is one of the single worst failures of technology in the energy space for a very, very, very long time. And somehow it kind of gets this free pass of like, well, it's like, give it another decade, like it'll be fine. It's so strange. You get this really noticeable dual attitude of excessive pessimism for the things that seem to be working and excessive optimism for the things that are demonstrably not working. And that is so unhealthy.
Do you want to just explain what carbon capture and storage is really quickly? So I don't want to
Ye-
assume a low level of understanding, but it's always better.
Yeah, no, please
Yeah.
jump in because I think what I'd like to then segue into is the fact that, when it comes to our domestic policies, it is carbon capture and storage and carbon offsets that seem to be doing the heavy lifting. And yet both of them have real problems and that seem to undermine the integrity of the statistics around how much we're actually reducing emissions. So, Katan, perhaps if you can just explain to us what CCS is, and then we might move into in that discussion.
This is really important. So, uh, point source CCS, or carbon capture and storage, it's when you have a machine that's attached to a pipe on a power station, for instance, where the carbon comes out. And you capture that carbon at the point of the power station, right? It's just getting pumped out of it. You're burning things. It's the pollution coming out of the power station. And you have a machine that captures it. And then the idea is that you transport it and store it underground. For the most part, this is not what happens. The carbon that gets captured actually gets used in this other technology to help dislodge oil and gas from reservoirs that are nearly depleted. So you can actually pump it down into these spongy type reservoirs and then use it to dig up more oil and gas, which
Good.
is yeah, go on,
It's
Dave.
using the carbon to get more fossil fuels.
Exactly, yeah. It's called enhanced oil recovery, which is such a lovely euphemism. So that's actually the majority of carbon that's captured today in this technology gets used exactly for that purpose, mostly in the US, but in a bunch of other places. And so that's called point source CCS. So you're actually reducing the emissions hypothetically from a gas extraction site or a power station. The other thing people may have heard of is called carbon removal or atmospheric carbon removal. So you're not actually capturing it from the pipe of the power station or the gas plant or whatever. You're actually just taking the air from around you and you're kind of reaching into it and you're trying to extract carbon from it. And it's sort of, it's better in the sense that you can do it from anywhere, but it's much worse in the sense that it's a very low concentration of carbon. You think about it coming out of the power station, very high amount of carbon, but if you pull it from the air, it's really sort of a weak amount of carbon, which means you have to use big fans to pump huge, huge volumes of air. And so then, you end up with really, really huge amounts of power being used by direct air capture, atmospheric carbon removal. So it's, and then of course, it also gets used to pump more oil and gas from the ground.
This
So
is
And
so
it's
much
also a
worse than I thought it
relatively
was. I really did think it was a whole look over here, we're going to keep pumping fossil fuels, but it's actually look over here and we're going to use this to get more fossil fuels.
Yeah.
And any of the carbon which is actually removed, we're talking about a relatively tiny amount compared to the emissions or the carbon which is going into the atmosphere. And there's always this sense that, we'll be able to scale it up at some point in the future, maybe in 10 years' time, 20 years' time, when we've invested more and more billions of dollars. But Polly, CCS is one of the key strategies that the Labor Party, that the Albanese government are using or saying they're going to use to help get us to this net zero amount by 2050. That and carbon offsets, both of which are clearly problematic when it comes to actually real material impacts on the climate and environment.
Oh yeah, they don't actually believe CCS will ever work. It's never factored into our projections. They know it won't work. It's just a really great tool to say that we can keep extracting and producing gas in Australia, and gas companies can also meet their net zero targets while increasing emissions. I want to point out that yes, okay, so there's I'll park CCS and offsets for a minute, but I want to point out that Labor's climate policies or policies mostly are just coalition policies, and they actually just picked up where the coalition left off. So CCS and offsets are one part of that, but Labor is just as committed to fossil fuel expansion as the coalition was. They're currently 100 coal, oil and gas projects recognised as under development. Labor is just as committed to fossil fuel subsidies, and they are subsidies using the World Trade Organization definition of a subsidy. If you look at the federal budget, federal fossil fuel subsidies are set to increase each year to at least 2027. Most of the senior executives in the public service that were running a protection racket for the coalition's fossil fuel expansion and CCS, unicorns and carbon offsets are still in the same positions under the Labor, running the same lines in estimates. Labor is still appointing industry interests to government bodies, and yes, as you said, they're still promoting and subsidising things like carbon capture and storage and carbon offsets that essentially allows their mates in the gas industry to say that they can increase fossil fuel production and also say they're net zero. Australia's subprime carbon offset scheme is a coalition policy. Basically, the coalition built this machine that would spit out millions of low quality carbon offsets and keep the price really low. So Labor's still using that. The safeguard mechanism, our key climate policy, is a coalition policy. Even after the changes that were passed in Parliament, it still allows polluting facilities to increase their emissions as long as they buy offsets, and it allows them to infinitely or exponentially increase their coal and gas production. So there's very little that's different. To get to that idea of using offsets to meet our climate targets, and Ketan probably would be good at explaining this, but so the Australian government, I note, has recently said, just at the end of last week, they put out their latest emissions data saying that Australia's reduced emissions by 29% since 2005 levels. The only reason they can say this is because basically we cook the books when it comes to our climate accounts. And this figure's misleading because it relies almost entirely on emissions reduction in the land sector. So trees going, basically, or trees not being cut down, or trees growing back. And these, these land sector emissions have become, you were talking about sequestration earlier, Dave, they've become a sink where they store more carbon than, well, trees store carbon, right? So this premise is used to notionally offset fossil fuel emissions that are generated in other areas of the economy. I don't know if that makes sense. It's really hard to sort of give you a quick and dirty explanation of Australia's dodgy accounting, but that's how offsets are used to say that Australia's meeting its climate targets.
I don't
Do you want me
understand
to just
science anywhere near as well as you two do, but it does also seem like the fossil fuel materials that we extract and sell to other countries, we do not count any of those emissions at all in our, which is another way of cooking the books, because surely that should count.
Yeah, well, yeah. What's interesting is that Australia is taking credit for being a renewable energy superpower, where we will be exporting green hydrogen and green electricity and whatever, and we want to take responsibility for that. But when it comes to taking responsibility for all the emissions that we ship offshore, that still impact Australia when they're burnt in terms of climate change, there's a real hypocrisy there where if you want to take credit for the good stuff, so you're going to have take responsibility for the bad stuff too.
I don't know if politicians work that way, but
No.
sounds good in
Ketan, do
theory.
you want to talk about that perhaps and the offset issues from a global perspective as well? I mean, because it does seem that all of this is about masking the central issue and delaying the central issue, or indeed denying it, that we have to actually stop burning fossil fuels.
Yeah, we don't in the climate space. We don't have a good sensitivity or like radar for detecting when a particular pathway for measuring or reporting or acting on emissions causes this danger of masking problems and bringing about this sense of achievement when we haven't actually done any achievement. And Australia, I constantly bring up Australia to my friends here because it's such a good example of the way that you look at the world, the way that you measure things, actually being a major, major problem. And so something I discovered a few years ago is that Australia, not only does it have the problem that Polly described, which is like we're constantly digging up fossil fuels, burning them, and then pretending that trees are sucking up the carbon again. Our emissions were on a similar trajectory to what I said before, in the sense that it looked like things were improving. Australia was building a lot of renewables. The projections were constantly overstating what the actual emissions were, so it looked pretty good. And then, kind of 2 or 3 years ago, it all changed again, right? So our projections are now actually below what our actual emissions end up being, which means that things are worse than was thought they would be in the past, right? And so what has happened, and I'm sure that this is a complete coincidence, is that the methodology for measuring land use emissions has changed. And it just so happens that the changes to the methodology for how we determine how much carbon is being sucked up by trees and grasses and vegetation says that emissions are much lower than they actually were, that what we thought they were before, right? So it's like, oh, cool, grasses actually suck up more carbon than we thought. Trees suck up more carbon than we thought. And so what you end up with is this picture. Not only is it masking a failure to act on climate change, it's masking things getting worse, right? So it's actually really, really bad that it's so effective at hiding both inaction and things actually becoming worse in terms of higher emissions than we expected. And so I actually had a look at the most recent data that just came out a day ago, and the projections for what 2024 would end up being for the past 3 years were all lower than what it ended up being, quite by quite a large margin, right? So 2024 ended up much, much worse than was expected by previous projections and forecasts. And so there's this huge debate in the EU about separating out these numbers. Trees, soils, grasses, everything, you've got them in one bucket. They've got their own target. Obviously, we do actually need to be like planting trees and protecting nature. And then fossil carbon, right? Like the stuff you dig up from underground, it's in its own separate bucket, and they cannot touch each other, which means that you can't have this greenwashing effect. And there's so many people like pushing really hard for separate targets, but it's a slog because governments realize the worth of smushing them together so that you can mask inaction or mask things getting worse.
And in the meantime, it is actually getting a lot worse. I mean, if we look at what came out of COP28 in Dubai, which was chaired by the CEO of the Abu Dhabi National Oil company, and then the way that I think since the election of Trump, kind of a lot of the big oil and gas companies have actually even given up the pretense that they are trying to move into greener ways of doing business. I mean, just this week, I think BP just abandoned its green targets and has just said, look, the green ambitions aren't working. We got the transitions wrong. So actually, we're just going to go back to more oil and gas. And that seems to be happening with whether it's Exxon Mobil or Chevron or BP. All of them are just basically continuing to do business as usual. And the change seems to be that they're not pretending that they're not anymore.
Yeah, it's worth noting that BP basically announced those targets in 2021. To some of our surprise, in the sense, it's very unusual for a fossil fuel company to announce a target to sell less fossil fuels. And there was some dodgy little tweaks in there, but still, it was just unusual. And then the next year, we sort of checked in on whether or not they're building new oil and gas, doing more exploration, and of course they were, right? Like they just set the target, but they just kind of continued doing what they've done for many decades.
And that's continuing to happen, Polly, as you say, here in Australia as well. And the Australian government is continuing to subsidise that here. So it is pretty much greenwashing that's been going on both from Labor and the Coalition. And now the Coalition have kind of even given up on pretending that they're going to stop supporting the fossil fuel industry for the next few decades, because that's the amount of time it's going to take to build their new nuclear industry from scratch. Now, I don't want to spend much time on this. I don't want to spend much time on this because it does not warrant it. But perhaps could you just give us, in the shortest amount of time possible, or whether it's from a timeline, it's from cost, it's from, as the Climate Change Authority said this week, the emissions bomb that will be exploded while we get to this sort of mythical kind of nuclear industry. All of the reasons that this is just a joke and really is just delaying action again.
Yeah, honestly, I think you're right. There's no point spending that much time on it. Even if nuclear was a viable proposition in Australia, the coalition's not serious about it. They know that they don't care. They don't want nuclear in Australia. They want more gas and coal. And what is infuriating is it's, again, the media that keeps breathing life into this deliberate circular hysteria over nuclear power, which actually suits both parties beautifully. There's this contrived conflict over nuclear, which is solving a whole lot of political problems, but no real problems. And so the coalition benefits from the fight over nuclear because they are chaos merchants and they want to conceal their internal disagreement over renewable energy and protect their friends in industry. And as you say, it's about just keeping gas and coal going as long as possible. And the Labor government gets to look like good guys. They use this highly visible and performative conflict over nuclear energy to look like they've got more climate ambition than they do and distract voters from the strength of bipartisan support for fossil fuels. So Labor is just as committed, to be clear, to fossil fuel expansion as the coalition is. They don't hide it either. We've got
Madeleine King is out there saying as much. It is business as usual.
They've got their gas to 2050 future gas strategy. The narrative is that we'll basically, if we stop selling gas to Japan, we'll be inciting World War III. To go back to Labor, what's different, and you alluded to this before, Dave, is that Labor's better at PR. It's smarter at promoting green policies, I'll do the more inverted commas, and green subsidies. It's got great PR about being a renewable energy superpower. It's just, it neglects to say that it wants to export renewables as well as fossil fuels. And it's far better at promoting its green subsidies and policies like the Future Made in Australia policy, which is, just to bring everyone up to date, it's a whole lot of subsidies and tax incentives that equate to about $20 billion But when you look at the numbers in the budget, that's $20 billion over 10 years, and most of the measures don't start until 2027. You compare that to the very real fossil fuel subsidies, it's over $10 billion from federal government alone every single year. They're just very good at inflating and using that $20 billion number without saying it's actually a tiny amount.
We're going to go to our interview now, which unfortunately is not with Joelle Gerges because she was a little bit unwell this week. But we've got Alex Fein from Redbridge, and what she's going to talk to us a bit about is what voters are feeling now and what the implications of that are moving forward. And so when we come back, we'll apply that very directly to how we can talk about climate to inspire and galvanise actions. Alex Fein, welcome to the Sunday Shot.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Jo.
You work at Redbridge, which is one of Australia's leading polling and social research companies. And across the years, you've consulted on a number of progressive campaigns, including for some progressive MPs, independents and others. And you spend a lot of your time doing qualitative primary research, which means, I believe, spending a lot of time talking to voters.
It's the most extraordinary opportunity to be able to talk to people most nights of the week. With qualitative research, people will often go in directions that you don't expect. And the capacity to get those unexpected responses to reorient your thinking as a researcher is, an extraordinary, I think, privilege.
And in the qualitative research, you say you're talking to people pretty much every night. What is a snapshot of what people are telling you at the moment about things that are important to them and what they're feeling at this stage of the electoral cycle?
So it's become almost a cliche that cost of living is the only game in town. But people have been suffering now for quite a while, and really suffering. What they're also telling us that I think gets missed a lot is that they're overwhelmed by the information space that we exist in. We talk about the 1% in economic terms, the people right at the top of the socioeconomic food chain. What we never talk about is the other 1%, the informational 1%, the people, for example, who consume the shot.
Yes.
It's a really small proportion of the population that is engaged in the political process and that engages with this information, because most people find it too noisy, too overwhelming, too many contested spaces. They don't know whom to trust. And there has been this mass switch off from news and traditional kind of sources of political information.
And what are the implications of that for our political candidates and leaders as we move into the election?
People really hate the nastiness as well. It genuinely upsets people. And everyone accusing everyone else of being a liar, even though there might genuinely be a liar in the conversation, that does not gel with people. So it's actually a really interesting phenomenon. We find that a lot of voters get really frustrated because they don't know what's being done by, say, a particular politician or party. And they're saying, why don't we know this? But they don't know because to consume that information would be, for a variety of really complex reasons, too burdensome. And so they're getting more the vibe of the thing. So I'll give you a concrete example. A lot of people have kind of a vibe around Peter Dutton, and it's not necessarily a positive one, but a lot of people can't even name who the opposition leader is.
Right.
Lots. And a lot of those people, you'll say, oh, it's Peter Dutton, and they'll go, yes, I've heard of him. And then you'll kind of get some of them, you know, again, on the vibe of the thing. Yeah, I've heard he said some pretty harsh things, but other people will say, well, I don't know anything about him. We've got to give him a chance because it can't be worse than now.
Ah, right. So that is a big risk for the government and the Labor Party, that people turning off and not engaging with politics but feeling disconnected and a little bit tetchy about their situation, that is when they could be persuaded in the moment in the polling booth to go for
Yeah.
change.
And I want to make a distinction as well between people being disengaged from the political process and from like the journalism and the media around it versus being disengaged from the political issues. They care about the issues deeply, and they often are incredibly sophisticated in the way they conceive of those issues. They just hate the kind of horse raceness of it all and the way things are framed because it doesn't have direct relevance to them. So it's a really complicated space, but the more human that a politician is able to sound and the more human the person that they're talking to is able to sound, the more likely whatever they're saying is to cut through. So that kind of those journalistic concepts of the tricky question here and then the talking around it and not answering it, people just won't engage with that at all.
Are they getting their information from such information as they are getting? Are they getting it from particular sources outside of, for want of a better term, the legacy media? Is it spaces like podcasts? Is it through social media with the algorithm serving up the things that it thinks that they want based on past consumption? Or are there other ways that they are informing themselves to the extent that they are at this point?
Some are, most are actively avoiding it, and they put the contested spaces in, they use these words, the too hard basket. And it's depressing, and they don't want to engage with it at all. And there is such a cornucopia of content available. They don't have to. And so, you know, a minority will maybe engage with those sorts of podcasts, maybe. An even smaller minority with like the less traditional political content. Most people are just avoiding it completely. And a really interesting phenomenon that some people speak about is having a designated driver informationally in their familial or social circles. There's someone who will consume all that crap for them and then digest it and regurgitate it in a form that is kind of less overwhelming.
How then are people, if to the extent that they are at this point, intending to make up their mind about who to vote for? You said they're responding to more of a vibe thing. Does that continue in that way, or as we move into the pointy end of the electoral cycle and indeed the campaign proper, do things shift, or is there even more an attempt to turn it off? And then how are decisions ultimately reached about who to vote for?
On some pretty odd bases, like I think a lot of people probably wouldn't vote if it weren't kind of compulsory to attend. Some people do like a last minute Google. A lot of people will ask their informational designated driver, who do I vote for?
Right. Wow. So what should the strategy be? And we're an unashamedly progressive program here. So what should the strategy be for the independents, the progressives, even Labor, when it comes down to it, to try and cut through and reach, whether it's the designated driver or influence the vibe?
So it's in a sense really simple and really, really complicated. If there are things on which, like topics on which there can be agreement to boost that on socials and to get kind of a positive feedback loop, because the algorithm also penalizes political content and it can penalize progressive political content as well, right? And to signal boost each other is quite important. More important than that is the ground campaign,
Yep.
right? So find whatever party, candidate, whatever that suits your personal political orientation or values and volunteer from now. There is nothing more important than those on the ground persuasive conversations, the social proof of seeing you in the t-shirt. That is massive. Having the sign up on your front lawn. These things have the most outsized imaginable impact. People say, oh, you know, I had no idea who I was going to vote for, but then I saw politician X's face everywhere in the electorate, and I figured, well, if everybody thinks they're good enough, then they must be.
It legitimises the idea of voting, for, say, particularly for the independents, when previously that might have been the quixotic lone corflute on a Stobie pole, as we'd say in Adelaide.
Exactly. And just being nice as well. I know it sounds really facile, but it's a deep thing. Being nice in your candidate's t-shirt and showing that there's just a different way to do politics, that it doesn't have to be nasty, it doesn't have to be confrontational, that contested space that people find overwhelming, that there are positive things that could happen as a result of the next parliament if these people were elected. That can be really powerful as well. But sort of in a longer term sense, I think we need to get away from sort of this hyper focus on just the campaigns. We need what is called community organising beyond the field. Things probably fell down a little bit in the American context because community organising started to mean only field organising. So they were just getting out the vote. They were just registering people, that sort of thing. And by then it's almost too late. The best kind of bulwark against problematic politics is actually community connection, and that term social cohesion that is kind of used in some really interesting ways these days, but what we used to understand to be community connection. So volunteering in different places, being a part of your community, finding other community members who share your values outside of the election cycle that can then be activated for the values you want to see represented in Parliament. That's actually really important.
You mentioned that progressive views can sometimes be penalised through algorithms. There does seem to be internationally a sense that the left is not cutting through and that we are entering dangerous times where the message of the right is getting much more traction generally. Why do you think that is?
A person much smarter than me said, the right seek converts and the left seek traitors, right? So the right has this massive structural advantage in that media owners are generally more likely to be right-wing, fine. Social media owners sell more through outrage that kind of facilitates right-wing discourse, that sort of thing, and they tend to be on the right themselves as well. But there are ways that progressives could gain that. If we were signal boosting each other rather than looking for who's not being quite left-wing enough or who is being treacherous in whatever way you want to kind of characterize it, we could do what the right does, because what the right does is they will have kind of legacy media kind of spearhead some sort of issue, and then they will signal boost the hell out of it, whether it's their pet issue or not. And where we need to start is not with our social issues. So I know we care about, and we care about it because it's so important, about things, abstractions like democracy and integrity and all these sorts of things, right? But we're part of the 1% who cares about it because we're consuming a particular informational diet. Most people are not kind of consumed by this stuff, and it doesn't mean anything to them, so it cannot cut through. It can't algorithmically reach them ever. So if we were all talking about economic justice together, we would be able to create an in-group, which is really critical to persuasion. And we could kind of leverage that algorithmic signal boost as well. And once we had created our economic justice in-group, we would have the longer term capacity to get all those kind of more abstract social issues sorted, because we would have generated trust. At the moment, no one trusts really a lot of progressives, because either we're berating or some perceived treachery, or we're not talking about those bread and butter issues that really matter to people. Ask why people can't afford to see a bulk billing GP, why they can't afford to get a diagnosis for their disability so that they can access the NDIS. Sort of try to get to the bread and butter issues that matter to most people.
So good old-fashioned solidarity, really.
Yep.
Yeah.
If we don't start there, we will finish nowhere.
Well, Alex, thank you very much for joining us on the Sunday Shot. We look forward to having you back as we go through the election and hearing some of those insights and actually doing some deep dives into some of the contested seats as well. So thank you very much.
Been a pleasure. Thanks so much.
Polly, they're very interesting insights that Alex was making about abstract issues can be hard for voters, indeed citizens, to get their heads around. Obviously, the coming climate apocalypse is going to be the very opposite from abstract, but at the moment there does seem to be a disconnect. What kind of strategies do you think that we could be deploying now to try and galvanise support around these sort of existential issues?
Well, I don't think there's any single simple solution here. But to be honest, I don't think people are scared enough. Fear, we know fear motivates people. It's not this idea that, the climate crisis is a great economic opportunity, or we can be a great, green energy superpower, or the prosperity of critical minerals, blah, blah, blah. If hope and optimism motivated people, then we wouldn't get vaccinations, we wouldn't get insurance, we wouldn't worry about how much super we had. There's this theory called loss aversion, which is basically the people prefer to avoid losses over achieving equivalent gains. Broadly speaking, people feel pain from losses far more than they feel pleasure from gains. And I think there's not enough focus on what people are going to lose when it comes to climate. And I don't think enough attention is given to the opportunity cost of fossil fuels, or what we are losing to go to that, that day-to-day thing. Why can't you afford to go to the doctor? Why is dental not included in Medicare? It's because our government favours the corporate status quo and favours fossil fuel companies and gives billions to fossil fuels. We've seen that the promise of prosperity and infrastructure and money from gas and coal projects in Australia has never, ever manifested, but it doesn't get... There's still this idea that gas is the backbone of the Australian economy, and no one ever really questions it. I had this really heartbreaking phone call with a nurse in the Hunter Valley who told me a baby had died because there was no appropriate paediatric care in that region. And this is in mining country, like coal mining country. And she was so distraught, and she asked me where all the money from coal mines was going, because it certainly wasn't going to the community or to health or education. Similarly, in terms of employment, if the government wants to expedite gas and coal expansion, then it pulls workers who may not even be working in the fossil fuel industry at the time onto these projects. And so there's simply not going to be enough workers for infrastructure and manufacturing and other things like that. So beyond the existential, fossil fuel companies are causing so much damage directly to us, not just to the climate. And you've probably seen Punters Politics, who's clearly talking to people who don't actually care about climate, but care about being ripped off by big business. And Comms Declare, another organisation, talks about air pollution from fossil fuels and the direct health impacts of that. So I know I sound facetious, but I actually do think we need to use fear more, and what is at stake in a country like Australia, where currently we have so much and we're so wealthy and so lucky. The fact that we could be complacent at all about losing that is pretty baffling.
It's a fine line, isn't it? Because I want to pick up on a point Alex made about people becoming overwhelmed and switching off in this moment. And that's not something people should be ashamed of. That is just human psychology. We tend to seek comfort more than we seek disconcerting, world upending truths. Like, yesterday I depressed everyone and wrote an article about the Nazi oligarchs in the White House. And in the process of doing that, I felt myself needing to tune out every now and then because it's a lot. And when we're talking about existential crises like we are today, you need to inform, but you don't want to demobilize people. You don't want to crush them with. I do think hope is important as well as fear. Star Wars guy, rebellions are built on hope. This is how we keep
Yeah,
going.
I
But
think. Oh, sorry, go on.
no, I was just going to say, I mean, Ketan, like reporting this stuff in a way that is informative and helpful and mobilizing, but not crushing to the soul. I mean, how do you do that on a day-to-day basis? Because this is big stuff.
Can I be really rude and just quickly add something there before
Please.
Catan speaks? But I was going to say, I think the difference is with climate is we're not given the actual solutions or told what to do. So if you're worried about pandemics, the solution is get a vaccination, and that the government tells us to do that. The solution to financial insecurity or accidents is to get insurance. The problem is that the solutions that we're given in terms of climate are completely false, and so people see emissions rising even though they're buying keep cups and solar panels and stuff. And so it's not necessarily the fear, it's that they're not given adequate or truthful solutions to that.
It's actually such a great example because hope can be exploited, hope can be presented falsely, and so it's something you have to manage really carefully. Throughout my career, the thing I've always been quite obsessed with has been fatalism, and I think fatalism gets used, it gets exploited as well. The idea of hopelessness, or you can't actually do anything. Governments love being fatalist. And so a nice example maybe is Australia's coal fleet. It's actually one of the most concentrated coal fleets on the planet, which means if you shut one power station down, you cause a massive difference to emissions and you avoid a huge amount of cost and harm and suffering. And yet, going into this next election, people are, as Polly said earlier, having this performative spat about nuclear when many, many millions of actual human lives are at stake depending on the trajectory of the coal fleet. The sooner you shut it down, the less we suffer. It's such a straightforward, both the threat, the fear, the actual danger of the machines, but then also the agency, the actual solution, what you can do about it. Shut the damn things down earlier, right? It's something that we understand really intuitively. We get danger and we get the risk, yet somehow the conversation just gets deleted, and it really sucks. And it's a good thing to try and bring back.
And there
And
is
what?
also, just quickly, there is also like there's a lot of the solutions, the technological based solutions, we know already, like, don't we? That it is just about the political will to implement them.
Yeah, absolutely. And uh, it's kind of like a sliding scale. 80% what we have in front of us, we have. There's this kind of like final 20 to 10% that requires a bit more research, but it becomes this weird proxy for like, oh, there's no hope because we don't have 100% solved right now. Then we kind of shouldn't bother with all the stuff that we actually know how to do and deploy right now. And it's this really tricky little dance that they do that I hate because there's so much that we should be getting on with right now.
One thing I want to add to this discussion, it's not about the climate science, but it is about Western government's response to the inactivity, is that what's happening in Australia and the UK, and I'm not sure about the US, but I would assume so, is that anti-protest laws are really being ramped up, and that is because they know they're not doing enough, and they know we will be increasingly upset as the decades roll on.
Yeah, I mean, that is an incredible thing. And it does, particularly over in WA, but it's also happening here in New South Wales and down in South Australia, this sort of notion that the government is now policing the actions of citizens on behalf of the fossil fuel industry. So this notion of state capture / petro state seems, very real. We are coming, though, I'm afraid, to the end of our discussion for today. I really want to thank Ketan and Polly for joining us this morning, particularly Ketan staying up late over there in Oslo. We hope you've enjoyed our conversation. If you have, perhaps you might consider heading to the Shots website and maybe just chucking a few dollars in so that Dave and I can have our morning coffee bought for us and we can keep on air until at least the election. I think one of the key takeaways from this discussion is that we need to demand more of our political leaders, and if they won't provide, we can change them at the next election. So get out there wearing those T-shirts for climate-informed and supportive candidates and incumbent MPs. Next week, we are diving deep into AUKUS and the Australian alliance with the US. We have Andrew Fowler and we have Emma Shortis joining us, and we have an interview from the US with Bruce Wolpe, who will have just witnessed the first address to Congress of the second incarnation of President Trump. So thanks again to Polly and Ketan. Dave, thanks for getting up. Happy Mardi Gras, everybody, and we look forward to seeing you next Sunday.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.